Welcome. My name is Nuno Sacramento. I'm the director and curator of Peacock and the Worm in Aberdeen. It is the arts organization hosting the exhibition Dreams and Dangerous Ideas. This exhibition is a follow-on from Another World is Possible, which was an exhibition about the radical history of the community printing workshop in Aberdeen. I'm very excited to welcome two of the women that were involved in the women's liberation movement in Aberdeen in the 70s and 80s. One of them, Chris Aldred, was active in various Aberdeen's women's liberation groups in the 1970s. And this involvement inspired lifelong work in adult education and work with communities, both organizing and teaching a range of community-based courses, especially those for women. She contributed to the early STUC and TUC initiatives in trade union education for and about women, and continues to be an active trades unionist. We also have Kath Mackay, who was influenced by the women's liberation, Aberdeen women's liberation work in the 1970s, particularly the education developments and the arguments about childcare being essential to allow women with children to work and learn. After graduating in 1981, she developed women's discussion-based work in Kincorth using the WEA and health-based materials. Crash provision ran alongside these groups, which enabled women with young children to attend. Many of these women gained confidence and went on to more formal qualification-based learning. This led Kath to a lifelong focus and interest in work with women, particularly in community-based settings. So over to you, Kath.
Thank you, Nuno, and welcome to everyone who's participating in our first webinar on equal pay. It's quite disconcerting. I can't actually see you, but I know you're out there. I'm going to start by just giving a little bit of context for the exhibition that's on the website. As Nuno said, the Dreams and Dangerous Ideas exhibition is really 2 decades of the women's liberation movement in Aberdeen. It brings together archival material, memories, stories by some of the activists involved in the movement at the time. That's Chris Aldred, Louise Irvin, myself, Margaret Lockery and Sandy Wiles. And really there was an awful lot of other people involved that helped us to gain additional material and help us to sort out our ideas. So the exhibition, we worked very closely with the University of Aberdeen, so thanks to Andrew, the archivist there, and also, of course, Peacock and the Worm. So Nuno and Neil, and particularly thanks to NG, who worked particularly hard in transforming our thoughts and our ideas and our materials into a wonderful exhibition. The nationwide women's liberation movement emerges in the climate of protests and civil uprisings that characterized the 1960s and 70s in many countries. The movement is widely considered to have started in 1970 with a national conference at Ruskin College in Oxford and a mass protest at the Miss World competition later that year. The demands of the inaugural conference were equal pay, free childcare, free contraception and abortion quickly attracted support from tens of thousands of women in all parts of the UK. At that time, 40 years on from gaining the right to vote, women were treated as second-class citizens, discriminated against in practically all spheres of life, and subject to patriarchal attitudes and restrictions. The exhibition, we really hope that the exhibition brings together people from all generations in the city to reflect on current and past experiences and form new solidarities. And we had an excellent opening night on International Women's Day. And we were particularly encouraged that there were many younger people attended the exhibition. It's going to run for a month. And Nuno tells us that it's very popular, it's busy, people are coming in and coming back. And so it's plenty of time for you all to sort of visit or revisit and to tell all your friends. As I said, this is our first webinar on equal pay, and I'd like to pass over to Chris in a minute, Chris Aldred, who will be presenting her thoughts shortly. Nuna's already introduced Chris. She'll be well known to many of you, I'm sure, and she's had a lifelong career in adult education. Chris has a keen sense of preserving history, and in fact, many of the materials in the exhibition were actually sourced from Chrissy's attic. That was a good find, I think. If you've got any questions or comments that come to you while Chris is speaking, please put them in the question and answer space. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation, and also let us know if you'd like to actually speak your questions or comments or stories, and we do have the technology that should allow you to do that. Okay, so we're ready to start, and I'd like to pass over to Chris.
Hello, thank you, Kath. It's great to be here and to be able to share with people who are attending the seminar and perhaps people who will watch this recording later on. I'll just try to share my screen, so bear with me just a second. I think you should be able to see that now. I'm hoping you can. Can you let me know?
Not yet, Chris.
Not yet. I think I know what I've done. Sorry. My apologies.
That's it.
Great, that's good. Okay, I'll do it as a show now. Lovely. Thank you, Kath, for starting me off. Apologies for the technical faff there. The title of this workshop is Half the Sky on Half the Pay. The quote from Chairman Mao about women's role in the Cultural Revolution and in China in the 1960s. Though some people say it's an older quote than that. And in this seminar, I'm hoping to explore the ideas of resistance and revolution. I started out with the text that's in grey explains this story, but the story goes that I was going to talk about the first demand of the women's movement for equal pay and talk about the ways in which it was characterized by both resistance from women workers to employer pressures, but also resistance to change from employers and the society more broadly, and the challenge that equal pay did then provide to underlying ideas about what work we did that was paid. Unfortunately, when I tried a bit of artificial intelligence and asked it to write the speech for me, it wrote exactly the same stuff as I'd written, and I decided that was actually quite a boring approach to take. So I've decided instead of that to ask people to share their experience, and I'll try and share mine a bit in the light of the struggle for equal pay. And I do have with me two women who both went into men's jobs, Fiona Forsyth and Anne Henderson, and I'll ask them both to join me at one point in the seminar. Okay. So instead of talking about the things that the ChatGPT told me to talk about, which basically to summarize the role of protest in modern days and to evaluate the claims for equal pay and to call for action on this because there hadn't been much progress. I felt that the exhibition materials were more exciting because they caught some of the mischievous atmosphere of the times, the cartoons, the posters, and so on, which the songs, which were more about the feelings of the time. And I thought that was perhaps more interesting to share. The idea of what resistance looked and felt like is something that isn't caught by all the sources which you can find online, which will tell you about the struggle for equal pay, the changes in legislation, and all the other practical developments that did arise from women's movement action. And I also wanted to talk about possibly the idea of some of the demands leading to revolutionary kinds of action. The starting point for all the women's movement was actually consciousness raising. And I think the consciousness raising groups were absolutely critical in getting us to think about what paid work actually meant, and to bring our attention to the fact that we felt that the things that we did were not valued, whether those were things we did as individuals, whether we did them in the home, whether we did them collectively as workers. The things that women did were not seen and were not valued, and consciousness raising groups enabled us to see that. There were also some practical things about paid work which made it quite clear that women were treated differently. Paid work often had included men's rates and women's rates. There were men's jobs and women's jobs, sometimes quite explicitly jobs only for men and jobs only for women. Strange as that seems now, when advertisements for jobs and so on have to be apparently open to both sexes. One of the intractable problems of paid work, which was true both then and now, was that women did low-paid jobs, and at that time particularly were very underrepresented in trade unions, even though they represented some of the membership in practically all the unions where women were members. The number of representatives who went forward to union committees was much lower than the membership, and the number of officials was even lower. We were also implicated in the world of work. One of the Women's Liberation Group members from Aberdeen was a domestic manager in one of the hospitals. And she says, I remember the 70s with much nostalgia, walking miles on hospital corridors in high heels, paying men and women different rates, and then going to women's lib meetings in the evening, sitting on someone's floor. So she actually administered men's rates and women's rates for the same job in the daytime, but was also trying to take some feminist action in the evenings. Jean Hart's song from the Women's Theatre Group talks about the boss's darling, the woman who's working for the boss, paid worker. And these are some of the lines from her song, which I'll perhaps read in rhythm rather than try and sing, but come along down to the factory, the production line is turning. You work all day for the minimum pay. God knows what you'll be earning. Your patience and dexterity he's endlessly adoring. He says you're suited to the job, which means the job is boring. And the Women's Theatre Group caught some of the frustrations of women who were very aware that they were working in jobs that men would not do. They were very aware that they got lots of reward for being very good at particularly jobs which required dexterity or patience or good skills with people. Those were easy to praise, but the remuneration did not follow. Those jobs were very badly paid. Women's Theatre Group did actually perform in Aberdeen and inspired many of us by their very apt songs. There's been a long history of resistance to exploitation and low pay. The quote underneath the photographs is the quote from the beginning of the 20th century from a woman trade unionist. It appears in full on one of the labels with her proper credits as well, pointing out that men never have minded women working. They just don't like them working in an organized environment. Resistance to the Equal Pay Act came from employers as well. The Equal Pay Act had been put onto the statute book in 1970, but had been amended to make sure that there was a long time for employers to get ready for the massive change that equal pay would create, even though it was only bringing the rate for women workers up to the rate for the worst paid man in the same employment. The 5-year lead-in gave employers plenty of time to work out how to evade the Act, which they did in large numbers. And again, you can read about those struggles in more detail. But the feelings that we had at the time about that was of huge frustration that a piece of legislation that should have been moving things forward was not likely to do so. The Sex Discrimination Act was eventually introduced to run alongside the Equal Pay Act because women began to argue, and Aberdeen women were among them, that the employers would simply have men's jobs and women's jobs and only allow the appropriate gender to work in each and pay the rates still differently. So there was also a more widespread resistance to change, that the idea that men worked and women kept the home running was a very pervasive one. Later on, you'll see a quote from the TUC, which actually endorses that particular view. But the idea of a man's wage being sufficient to run a family, to pay for a whole family's needs, and women being basically workers at home was a bit more complicated than you would think to challenge, because some women felt that in arguing for equal pay, women would lose the status of homemakers, would be expected to go out to work. So there were contradictions around that period as well. Being a trade unionist was an interesting experience at the time. It was quite frequent that you would be a token woman. My first experience of being in a trade union committee was because I noticed that the committee was almost entirely male and had nobody from my grade of pay and from a temporary contract, which I was on at the time. And of course, I was invited onto the union committee, but really in a way that took me rather, a way they looked at me rather askance. The issues that were seen as women's issues were very hard to raise in a trade union meeting. Overtime pay would always trump the time of meetings, or equality issues. And often we felt we had to justify our presence. I attended a talk by a woman called Bertha, who's an African woman who came to Aberdeen in the 1980s, earlier this week. And she talked about being a Black woman in a very white city as having to constantly justify your presence in that environment. And I felt as a trade union woman that we were also constantly justifying our presence and justifying the challenge that we put to a male view of work, which was about promotions, overtime, grading, demarcation between jobs and skill. I felt I was very fortunate to move on to teaching and learning from trade unionists. In my work with the Workers' Educational Association, I ran quite a lot of shop stewards courses, and these gave me an opportunity to apply the ideas that I had from the consciousness raising groups to everyday working situations. And they also put me on the spot, so I had to learn through arguing how the ideas that I felt were important for women were going to be applied in a workplace situation. And I think always I knew that behind me there were the women in the women's groups who were willing to listen to what I was finding challenging about working largely with men in trade unions and trying to present feminist ideas through that channel. Without the support of the women, it would have been a very lonely battle. And I think other people may also have felt that same ability to act in the trade unions because they had a women's group to come back and talk to afterwards. Women's action around equal pay in the 70s and 80s was focused around the idea of challenging the concept of like work. The Equal Pay Act said that equal pay should be paid for like work. Like work was very narrowly defined at the outset, had work that was evaluated as the same under a job evaluation scheme added to the definition of like work eventually actually became work, equal pay for work of equal value. And as these campaigns progressed, every time there was resistance and women needed to argue for the campaign changes. The pictures you see are of strikes that were very famous in that period. The Trico strike in 1985 is the picture at the top, and the lower picture is the Grunwick workers who worked in a photographic lab. Also in the 70s and 80s, there was a need to protect women's jobs. Increasingly, some of the jobs that were industrial jobs for women were moving overseas as part of a globalization process. But the women who were working in tailoring and garment making were particularly badly affected. And one of the strikes that came quite close to Aberdeen was the Lee Jeans strike, where women occupied the factory to try to protect jobs in Scotland against redundancy and the closure of their local factory. They did manage to resist. Unfortunately, in the end, they lost out. The factory was closed. But those are interesting struggles to research a bit further if you're interested. I thought it would be good to ask two women who've been involved who were involved at the time in moving into a man's world, Fiona and Anne, and if they would like to contribute something about their experience of working in the 70s and 80s. I'll stop sharing my screen and maybe invite, if I can promote Fiona to a panelist and promote Anne to a panelist. I think you should now be able to contribute. Can I ask maybe Fiona to start off? Are you happy to do that, Fiona? I think it's still muted. Can I? Fiona was a woman active in Aberdeen and in the south of Scotland. Both have experience of working in men's world. So I'll just try and.
Hi, Anne. Okay, I'll get started. I think probably Anne has got a lot more to say, but in 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act came into force. It had been delayed for 5 years, the same as the Equal Pay Act. And there was some kind of very intrepid women in England that were kind of waiting on the doorstep of the Manpower Services Commission to demand, I think on the 1st of January, whenever, 2nd of January, to demand to get onto TOPS courses, to train and qualify in various trades. Now, and so they were the first women that kind of were breaking into craft work, because it'd been more or less impossible up to then for any woman to ever get an apprenticeship. And so they started an organisation called Women in Manual Trades. And because, as I say, that it wasn't the route of kind of going in as an apprentice, as a school leaver, was not really open. So what was happening was that it was more women that were kind of like in their 20s and 30s. And I was one of them. I went down to Newcastle and joined and went to a TOPS training centre where to train as an electrician in 1979, which just after Thatcher got in. So it was beginning to be really quite a hard time in general. There was mass unemployment developing and everything. Anyway, I went down there and it was sort of like a cross between an army camp in a primary school, you know, like there was about, I don't know, 400 men maybe, and me, you know, and it all was quite intimidating. And then I discovered, and they were all playing cards, you know, all the time in the lunch break. And I thought, oh my God, it was a gambling debt. Actually, they were just playing cheat or something, and that was really, you know, anyway, it was, so I was in this class, and I did end up getting a qualification. It wasn't very well recognised, really, as an electronics technician. And before that, I worked with another feminist as a self-employed electrician. But bearing in mind the time, we're talking about kind of 1980, 81 by then, and it was a recession, and, you know, the amount of money I was earning, I think I had to do a tax return, but I think I only earned £2,000 or something that year. You know, it was pretty pitiful. So then I got a job as a renal technician in a hospital. And that was really quite interesting. It was, you know, fairly male dominated, but you're working alongside very skilled nurses, renal nurses that were, you know, probably paid less. I'm never quite sure about that. So I have worked in some quite male dominated places, and though the health service had quite a different ethos, I would say, from you know, some of the women I knew that had managed to get a job as electricians, to be employed rather than self-employed. And I think they had a far harder time, really. I moved up to Glasgow, and I did start a Women in Manual Trades group in Glasgow. And it was interesting because this was 85 by then. And all the other members of the group were all young women, school leavers that were apprentices in various trades employed by Glasgow City Council. So that was great, you know, and, you know, we some of the stuff we did were, you know, workshops for girls in school and hassling city and guilds. Generally, I can't quite remember what we were hassling about, but, you know, trying to kind of encourage more girls to become apprentices and so on. But I think I haven't kept up to date with how many female apprentices there are now. But what happened was that because of kind of outsourcing, and you know, what's happened is that where there was a city building department in nearly all local authorities now, that's now arm's length. And so I'm not sure that there's the same drive as there was in the mid-80s, or when there was women's committees and so on. There was quite a kind of drive to make sure that some of the apprentices were girls, bearing in mind that it's quite difficult because at that age, you know, there's so much peer pressure. And certainly there was then, that, you know, and girls would find it, again, as we're saying, you know, kind of difficult to go into a very male dominated area, you know. So briefly, that was sort of my experience. I occasionally went to the odd electricians union meeting, which was fairly grim, you know, ETPU, which had quite a reputation anyway for being quite a reactionary union, you know, so that wasn't a lot of fun. But anyway, I think that gives you a bit of a flavour of what it was like, and I think Anne would have, you know, a lot more to say about working in a male-dominated situation. Okay.
Can I ask Anne then to contribute?
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, so yeah, my name is Anne Henderson. I joined the railway in 1982 in Glasgow, initially as a station staff member at Highland Station in the West End of Glasgow. And before that, I suppose what I was thinking when Chris was talking, that phrase of always knowing there was women behind me, there was other women to go to, was really, really important. I think that's been there all my life. I don't know when it started, when I started being aware of it, but certainly from my late teens and then being a student. I was a student at Edinburgh University. I did some sabbatical, I did some full-time work on the National Union of Students Executive, organising FE colleges. And the women's networks were really important, and kind of discovered the women's liberation movement in my teens, and it's kind of always been there. So going into the job in the railway partly came from, dealing with a recession. Absolutely. I did different temporary jobs when I kind of left the student world. Had a community work qualification, didn't get into that field of work, although I think that contributed to understanding the trade unions better, ironic, and actually. But I was part of different political networks I had been part of at university, and there was a kind of, and through that, the women I knew, quite an organised kind of supportive decision to try and get work in areas that were well unionised. And the railway was a closed shop at that time. I mean, after I was joined, the manager gave me the card for the union. You know, that was 1982. Obviously, that's a very different world now. But I wanted to be part of a place where I could learn about trade union movement or be part of that collective voice, which I guess came a bit from my student experience as well. And knowing there were other women and men who were doing that as well, that you could pick phone up to, was important. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, I guess, I don't know, surprised, but I really enjoyed working in the railway. I worked there for about 15 years. The station staff work, shift work, which again, I was surprised to discover actually quite enjoyed. And I think one of the things I learned very quickly, there were about 8% of the trade union membership that I was in was the National Union of Railwomen. About 8% at that time were female. But I learned very quickly that some of my preconceptions about who was actually working, like in nearly every family, the women were working as well. They may not have been in full-time work, and they weren't alongside me in the railway in that sense, but the wages that the men were earning was not sufficient to keep the house going, basically. So, and women were working. They were doing work around their husband's shifts, and they were working part-time around childcare and things we know. But in the main, they were working. And so you would pick up, and again, learned quite quickly that actually, in truth, although it was all men I was working alongside, nearly all of them, where they had children involved, were every second week, because of the shifts, they were also working on childcare. So that was quite interesting in terms of what had been in my head before I went there. But in terms of things that actual kind of experience as a woman, having a network of women to pick up the phone to was really important. There was only one other woman working in the area that I worked in initially in Strathclyde. She was a guard on the trains, and I worked in the station. So her train would come through, like 5 or 6 times a day, local services. Then you'd know that you'd see this one woman. There was another woman in a booking office latterly. And so it was important to know that, but guessing to some of the issues that this session's covering, equal pay wasn't an issue. It was that interesting, I guess, again, because I was going into a job on a good wage. I mean, relatively speaking, the wages were good. It was 1981, 82, there was mass unemployment. You were going into a job which, as soon as I got through probation, was permanent, with a secure and good pension. And the prospect of what I did later, I transferred into a guard's job and then latterly a train driver. So there were lines of promotion opened up due to industrial pressures. Actually, guards didn't used to be able to apply for drivers' jobs, but that was a change in the 1984-85 due to privatisation. So that wasn't an issue, but there were just quickly some of the other things that I would say. What was very difficult, and you didn't realise, I think I didn't realise how much, is that thing about having to pick your battles. And a lot of women will say that if they're in a predominantly male environment. It's not possible for your own mental health to argue about every copy of The Sun that's left lying on a bothy table, or every calendar that's offensive, or every swear word that puts you down not me down, but puts women down. But sometimes it all just gets on top of you. So there's a kind of thing. So I kind of like, probably my younger self would have thought, why are you letting those things go? But at another level, you were trying to do some other stuff. So I applied for a guard's job, was knocked back 3 times because there were no toilet facilities in the depot. That's not a reason to knock you back from a job, obviously. Sex discrimination, other legislation, and the trade unions sorted that out for me, and I got into guard's job. Then there was no suitable uniforms. So then there's a whole number of things that arise, which by arguing your own corner, hopefully you then also improve for everybody else. And just a couple of things that I think touch on the points that Chris also mentioned around invisibility of women. So I became a union rep very quickly, partly by accident, because, well, I became a branch secretary in the union in Glasgow Queen Street very quickly, but it was partly an act. I'd started helping take the minutes at a meeting, being the only woman at the meeting. But Wasn't always the only women at meetings. There was women employed in carriage cleaning grades and other grades who were very vocal and came to the meetings. But somebody had one of the branch officers had a tragedy in his family, so unexpectedly stepped into that role and then kept it up and as a union rep. So a female guard came to me at some point in the 1980s to say she'd come back from maternity leave, and the company, British Rail, were not giving her any annual leave. And the staff were clearly arguing that annual leave, that you've been on maternity leave, that's the same as being on holiday. And I just totally strikes a chord with me what Chris said there about the invisibility of what women do, you know, reproductive and unproductive labour, what's seen as not seen as work. And this woman had been on maternity leave, and the conditions in British Rail at that time were actually not very good. So the maternity leave period was quite short. There was no proper negotiated maternity pay above the state minimum, which again is a reflection of, you know, 100 years of the rail union not bargaining on behalf of women in the workplace because we were invisible. So those things have changed gradually, bit by bit. And I think that period in the 1980s and 90s was part of that wider change. You know, although there was the recession and the economic times, the trade union movement was looking at sexual harassment policies. They were looking at how the Sex Discrimination Act worked in the workplace. You know, women were knowing it existed, and they'd say, well, how does that work? Why have we not got toilet facilities? Or why have we not got uniforms that's safe? Or why is our time on maternity leave not being respected? You know, so I think there was but all the time you were knowing there was women behind you. Do you know what I mean? There was always somebody else you could go to check, even the Equal Opportunities Commission, or there was other resources. So lots of work that was going on in a broader sense that made working in, you know, there were times it was really difficult. I wouldn't be, you know, that would be true around, you know, sexism and yeah, just not given your place as an equal worker. But and I did just last thing to say, just I know there's a time thing. I did the driver training course in 1992. Now the instructor, I was the only woman on that course. So now it's a year, and for the initial period, you're in a classroom environment, learning all the rules of the railway, learning about chemicals for derailments, learning about diesel engines. The driving instructor, he's passed away now, but the traction instructor at that time was absolutely incapable of talking about a diesel. I learned about class 37 diesel engines. That was what we were qualified on. Every single part of the engine had a name that was linked to a female body part. Was absolutely wearing every single lesson, and he couldn't not talk about the engines in that way. And I just kind of reached a point where I just needed to blank it out and think up all the other acronyms for all the engine parts that suited the way I could remember it. So I passed the exam at the end. But you know, at another level, I'm like, it's kind of sad in a way that that's the only way you can remember and think about anything. Do you know, it was, well, not anything, but in that context, and all the men thought that was fine. And they were doing all these acronyms, repeating these rhymes as a way of helping remember the sequence when you were checking the emergency procedures on your engine. No, like, no, this isn't really good. So those things were on a daily basis were become wearing, and I think that's probably what a lot of women would say. But I discover other things, you know, like fantastic network. Men who were prepared to, once you explain things to you, they were like, well, we don't want our daughter to come into experiencing treatment that way. We're going to try and change this. And I think that that's more of a conversation that is possible in the movement these days. Thanks.
Thank you both very much for those insights into the experience of trying to train or do a male job in the period that's covered by the exhibition. I don't know if anyone has any quick questions for Anne or Fiona, or comments, or if I should just carry on and work through more of the presentation, thank you very much, both of you, though, for your really interesting accounts of what it was like. I'll go back to sharing. I hope. Kath, keep me right. Can you see that?
Yes, Chris, you're fine.
Thank you. That's great. The next theme really is the theme of challenging the double shift. The fact that women worked at work, as Anne said, many women worked outside the home as well as working in the home. And I really like the poster that was produced by the C-RED collective at the time, which says capitalism also depends on domestic labor. If you can't actually see the type on the poster, and it shows the industrial setting as having workers who are serviced entirely by domestic labor returning to the workplace. And I do take the point that Anne made, that that women were also out at work to make sure that ends did meet, and that some men were also therefore doing some childcare. But the evidence that was collected around the time suggested that the amount of work in the home done declined, started with women who were not in paid work doing the most, then women who had a part-time job, then women who had a full-time job, then men, was the result of surveys in the 1970s. And I think perhaps the most graphic illustration of the idea that capitalism does depend on domestic labor is the idea that is in those song words: that's 3 men that I work for, love, my boss, your boss, and you. So from The Maintenance Engineer by Sandra Kerr, quite a neat encapsulation of domestic labor contributing to the ability of employers to benefit from work. The double shift doesn't mention the, if you like, the triple shift, the value of reproductive labor. And I'll go on to look at some of that. The question really is who pays for domestic and reproductive labor, and how are the costs met? So in order to get a constant supply of workers, should we expect future employers to fund domestic and reproductive labor? Or should we expect the state? Who should pay for that constant supply? In the 1970s, there was still a view that the man's wage should was said to cover the costs of running a family. Questioning that notion has been quite important. The idea of maternity and paternity pay was being raised in the 70s. As Anne said, maternity rights at that time were extremely limited, and probably they were better in the railways than they were in ununionized occupations. The benefits that were available for maternity were for a very limited period, and there was no right not to be dismissed for becoming pregnant. It was a perfectly legal reason for dismissal. Even the TUC, this quote is from before the period we're speaking about, but the home is one of the most important spheres for a woman worker, was a quote from 1948, which was the era that most of the workers of the 70s and 80s would have been born into, and was really an attempt to encourage women to go back to the home after wartime jobs. The responsibilities at home for childcare lead to all kinds of difficulties in paid work, difficulties in accessing jobs, because domestic work has always got to be taken into consideration as well, who's looking after the children. Recruitment, and when in a society where it is traditionally the women that look after children and the men that get paid more, there are pressures that keep that vicious cycle running, that the access to jobs is better for the main breadwinner. So the main breadwinner therefore has opportunities for promotion, opportunities to clock up benefit entitlement from their wages, and at the point of recruitment, they'll be able to quote a higher salary than the person who's been at home, and where that is predominantly reinforcing gender roles as they were seen at the time, that will have an impact on the position of women in the workplace. One of the symptoms is job segregation, different jobs. Women and men were doing different jobs in the 1970s and 80s in different industries. at different times on different kinds of contract. And again, the different roles at home reinforced the male power, the power to bargain at work and the power to manage the finance at home. The job segregation now is somewhat less acute, but whole industries would be predominantly staffed by men or women at that time. And I like the cartoon on the right, because it just shows how lucky women are to have paid work. Looking at the symptoms of domestic labour not being paid for, that reinforces the roles at home, reinforces male privilege and power, and leads to a gender pay gap, which at the time was based on different rates of pay for men and women, and the gradual implementation of the Equal Pay Act began to close the gender pay gap just a little bit. But the hourly rates are now, well, in 2021, were widening faster than other countries, and our childcare costs are the highest proportionally. A recent report says that women have been priced out of work by childcare costs and are on different kinds of contract from, and still tend to be on different kinds of contracts. More women are on part-time contracts. In the setting in which I work, more women are on part-time contracts, on temporary contracts, and very few female jobs have access to overtime. I just wanted to summarize the sorts of issues that we're still wrestling with. That the issue of sex discrimination at work, there's still difficulty in accessing men's jobs. There's still difficulty in changing very male-orientated trade unionism. There are still issues around valuing domestic labour. At the time, the Wages for Housework campaign prompted fierce debate about whether housework should actually be something that was paid for in order to stress its economic value to capitalist society. And although I think that was never adopted widely as being a position that women wanted to hold in the women's liberation movement, it does raise the point of what value do we place on domestic labour. The other demands looked at, I think were really quite revolutionary in suggesting that we socialise domestic labour, including the demand for free 24-hour childcare. I think in the changing situation of now, we might be looking at free care for other groups as well. And at the time, people tried to break the mold of the family with the man as the main breadwinner and the woman as the subsidiary breadwinner, and trying to do different ways of organising roles at home. It's never been able really to sustain or to gain enough traction to become a major way forward for most families. And I think that's partly because of this cyclical problem of once somebody is actually the breadwinner, moving to their job makes sense. Changing jobs more frequently if you're the person who's the secondary wage earner makes sense, and so on. I think these issues are all still live, and I really want to just sort of finish on that note, but I did want just to flick through the labels that we've used for the exhibition exhibits, which talk about equal pay. And I'm not going to give you long enough to read these, and I don't apologize for that, because the reason for putting them here is if you can't come to the exhibition, this seminar should be recorded and you should be able to look at these later. So this is the second of the equal pay slides, which you'll be able to pause to read. There's also content description, a label for the bits of the exhibition about women and work, and a bit about women in the trade unions. So I hope you'll find those useful. And I think what all comes back to is that what needs to happen is both resistance and a social revolution of various kinds of change in the whole way we organize work before any kind of genuine equality will recognize the fact that we are holding up half the sky. I'm going to stop there and go back to Kath, who'll have a look at whether we have some questions. I think there's one sitting there in the chat.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That was really super. I mean, but I'm glad that you changed your idea about putting it more from your own perspective. I think you got, I think you got a shock when you put it into the computer and it would come up with the same things that you had put. So it's nice to have that sort of personal aspect on it, and also hearing from Anne and Fiona, having their kind of perspective and their experience was really brings the whole thing to life, I think. And that is the comment. The only comment we have so far in the chat is just appreciating Anne and Fiona's talks, you know, their talk about their own kind of experience. We don't have any other questions or comments, which doesn't mean to say that we can't just take something from anyone if they want. You would have to put it in the chat, I think, in order to let us see who might have something to say, or just any general reflection on Chrissy's presentation. Nothing so far. I'll ask a question, shall I? To you, Chris. I mean, obviously, I've been listening as you've been developing the whole talk, the presentation. So, anything that surprised you as you were looking backwards and kind of looking at the present?
I think looking at the exhibition and also looking at trying to prepare for the talk, it's really hard to remember what things were like. That there were actually people who were being paid on men's rates and women's rates. That discrimination was just something you took as a matter of fact occurrence, that you would be asked to only women need apply was actually, or only men need apply, would have been quite common things to see in an advertisement. Very, very different from now. And I think those were the things that came back to me as being so different about what was going on then.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Oh, that's great. We've got a few questions and comments now. Reflection from Claire, saying that it was very interesting. And what kind of relationship do you have with younger generations of women and men, so that the knowledge and consciousness raising can be passed on?
That's a good question. I think that the women's liberation movement perhaps has, or the women who were active in the women's liberation movement have lost contact with modern activists. And I'm disappointed by that. I can understand that life moves on and people's own lives get in the way of continuing in exactly the same form of political activity. I hope that seeing some of the things that we did do will inspire some young women to be active, because I think that if nothing else, being active is a much more fulfilling way of living than accepting discrimination against you. It feels like sometimes the fight is exhausting, but to give in actually perpetuates those feelings of powerlessness and weakness, and being able to take part in action, particularly collective action, is really important.
Yeah, and we do actually hope that the exhibition will maybe promote some of that discussion and energy again.
Mm-hmm.
a comment from Hazel, who is making a very relevant comment, I think. She says that the current childcare situation, it just resounds with Anne's comments about maternity leave in the 1980s. If women cannot afford childcare, it negates the right to statutory maternity leave. Maternity leave is not a gap year. Absolutely. There's a child to look after for about 18 years following. And I must admit, you know, the stats from that latest article that you put some of the stats in your presentation, it is really quite shocking, you know, that that women can't afford the childcare in order for them to go to work. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
I think it's the same problem, but it's recast in different ways in the different decades since then. That in the 1970s, the problem was women's problem to solve.
Yeah.
And very much it was the women that organised the childcare for their children. If it was not them doing it, it was the friend they've agreed to do a child minding share with, or perhaps an older relative. I think now many women find themselves unable to pay for childcare. It's a very costly thing. Grandparents are constantly roped into childcare in the families that I know where there are children attending school. Somebody has to pick up children, somebody has to look after children outside nursery hours. And in some ways, the day nurseries of the 1970s and 80s were more user-friendly for a working woman than the nursery provision of now, which tends to be shorter, more general entitlement, but the hours are not hours that were designed around women working or around families having two workers in them. They're hours that are designed around the needs of the child, which are fine, but it would be good to have some of that wraparound care as well, funded by the state.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of chimes in with Margaret's comment, which is that many women are now bringing up children by themselves.
Yeah.
And they've got no one to share domestic labour with. And they are the group that are most likely to be living in poverty and will find it the most difficult to find that childcare that they need.
Indeed. And in the time that I was teaching women trade unionists in the 70s, the women who were most active in the trade unions, funnily enough, were the women who did have children, often widows or people who had been divorced or abandoned by a male earner, who then who desperately needed the work, and who were the ones who were beginning to be able to challenge the argument that the man needed to pay for a whole family, whereas a woman just was earning, for the phrase was pin money, suggesting that the woman's income was not critical at all, and that even in families led by a woman, it didn't make that much difference. So I think those were important issues too.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of the time. We've got about 4 minutes left, and there is an interesting question, which I'm definitely going to get you to answer, Chris, which is any reflections on the gig economy?
Oh, good and bad. Yeah, it's great to be able to work when you want to. It's not great to have no work when you want work. It's probably the extent of my reflections. It's the idea of a flexible kind of work is superficially very attractive, but what it leads to is all kinds of problems with favoritism, with lack of provision of work when it's not readily available, and all that.
Yeah, okay. I think we need to draw to a close. And I just want to thank you, Chris, very much indeed. And that's given us a lot of food for thought. And hopefully people will be able to kind of reflect on it, come to the exhibition, see if there's lots of material there that actually reflect a lot of what you've been talking about. Also want to thank Anne and Fiona very much. As I say, that sort of brought things to life. And remember that there are another 2 webinars following in the next 2 Saturdays. If people are able to sign up for them, that would be great. And I think we will say goodbye. Thank you all very much for coming. It's been, even though we haven't really been able to see you, we know that you've been there with us in spirit. So thanks.
Thank you.